every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in Chicago in the spring of 1924 was thick with coal smoke and possibility. It was the Jazz Age, a time of flapper dresses, speakeasies, and a roaring, restless energy that promised to rewrite every old rule. The Great War was a fading memory, and the future seemed to be a blank page, waiting for a bold new signature. In the Gothic halls of the University of Chicago, this spirit of reinvention took on a heady, intellectual fervor. Here, the brightest young minds in the country were not just learning history, they were being told they had the power to make it. They were reading Nietzsche, who had declared God dead and heralded the coming of the Übermensch, the Superman, a being so superior in intellect and will that he was beyond the common herd's morality of good and evil. For most, this was a philosophical exercise, a thought experiment confined to lecture halls and late-night debates. But for two of the university's most precocious students, it became a blueprint, it became a permission slip. They were an unlikely pair, bound by a shared, toxic brilliance. Nathan Freudenthal Leopold, Jr., just 19, was a certified genius. He spoke 5 languages fluently, and was already a nationally recognized ornithologist, an expert on the intricate songs of warblers. He was small, intense, and looked at the world through thick-lensed glasses with an air of detached intellectual superiority. His companion was 18-year-old Richard Albert Loeb, where Leopold was introverted and academic. Loeb was handsome, charismatic, and wealthy. He was the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan and now a postgraduate student at Chicago. He craved thrills, excitement, a life less ordinary. Together, they formed a dark symbiosis. Leopold was infatuated with Loeb, and Loeb was captivated by Leopold's intellect, which he could bend to his own sociopathic desires. They saw themselves as Nietzsche's supermen, living on a plane of existence far above the tedious laws that governed ordinary people. To prove this to themselves, and to each other, they decided to commit a crime. Not a petty theft, but the ultimate transgression. They would commit the perfect murder. Their plan was meticulous, a product of months of cold academic planning. The goal was not personal. There was no animosity, no jealousy, no greed. The goal was the act itself, an intellectual exercise in flawless execution. The victim would be chosen at random, someone insignificant, to prove the pure impersonality of their power. They would create a complex trail of false clues, including a kidnapping and a ransom demand, to baffle the police, whom they considered to be their intellectual inferiors. The crime would be a work of art, a testament to their superior minds. And on May 21, 1924, they put their plan into motion. A young boy vanished from the streets of the affluent Kenwood neighborhood. A family was plunged into a nightmare, and a pair of horn-rimmed glasses, dropped unnoticed in the reeds of a lonely marsh, began a countdown on the perfect crime. Today, we dissect one of the most infamous cases of the 20th century. We will move beyond the headlines of the crime of the century and examine the intricate details of a meticulously planned murder that was undone by a single, simple mistake. We will explore the twisted philosophy that led 2 of the country's brightest young men to believe they had the right to kill. And we will witness the legendary legal battle that followed, a courtroom drama that put not just the defendants on trial, but the very concept of capital punishment itself. This is the story of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. This is the anatomy of a thrill kill. Nathan Leopold was born in 1904 into a world of immense privilege. His father was a millionaire shipping magnate, and the family lived in a stately mansion in Kenwood, one of Chicago's most exclusive neighborhoods. From his earliest days, it was clear that Nathan was different. He was a prodigy. He reportedly spoke his first words at 4 months old, and had an IQ that was later estimated to be over 200. He was a polymath, excelling in every academic subject he touched. By his teenage years, he was a published ornithologist, an expert on birds, who could identify hundreds of species by their calls alone. He was fluent in a dizzying array of languages, and he devoured philosophy, especially the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. But for all his intellectual gifts, Nathan was socially isolated. He was physically small, awkward, and found it difficult to connect with his peers. He saw them as simple, predictable creatures, operating on a lower intellectual frequency. His world was one of books, ideas, and the quiet observation of nature, a world where he was the master. Richard Loeb, born in 1905, was also a child of Kenwood's elite. His father was Albert Loeb, a retired vice president of Sears, Roebuck & Co. The Loeb family was even wealthier than the Leopolds, living in a sprawling estate that included a private tennis court and lush gardens. Richard, or Dickie as he was known, was the golden boy. He was handsome, charming, and effortlessly popular. Like Leopold, he was intellectually gifted, graduating from the University of Michigan at 17, the youngest in its history. But unlike Leopold, Loeb's brilliance was masked by a veneer of social grace. He craved attention and excitement. He was obsessed with crime stories and detective novels, seeing them not as fiction, but as manuals. From a young age, he committed a series of escalating petty crimes: shoplifting, small-scale arson, vandalism. These acts were not driven by need, but by a desire to prove his cleverness, to successfully defy authority and get away with it. He was governed by a profound sense of entitlement and a complete lack of empathy. The two boys had known each other for years, moving in the same rarefied social circles, but their intense relationship ignited at the University of Chicago. They were drawn together by a shared intellectual arrogance and a mutual contempt for the world around them. Leopold, the lonely genius, was mesmerized by Loeb's charisma and confidence. Loeb, the aspiring master criminal, was fascinated by Leopold's formidable intellect, seeing him as the perfect accomplice, a technical advisor for his dark ambitions. Their relationship was complex and deeply unequal. Leopold was in love with Loeb and would do anything to keep his attention. Loeb, aware of this, manipulated Leopold's devotion, using it to bind him into a criminal pact. They forged what they called a compact, a partnership dedicated to the pursuit of sensation and the commission of crimes. Together, they delved deeper into the philosophy of Nietzsche. They fixated on the concept of the Übermensch, twisting its meaning to fit their own narcissistic worldview. In their minds, the Superman was not a goal for humanity to strive for, but a special class of individual who already existed. They were the Supermen. As such, they were not bound by the slave morality of the masses. Laws were for common people. Guilt was an illusion. The act of killing for a superior being was no more significant than an entomologist pinning a beetle to a board. It was this corrupted philosophy that provided the intellectual justification for what they were about to do. They decided that to truly affirm their superiority, they had to commit a crime so profound, so audacious, that it would prove their status beyond all doubt. They would commit murder. The planning took over 7 months. It was their ultimate intellectual project, approached with the same rigor they would apply to a university thesis. Every detail was debated, refined, and perfected. Their first objective was to make the crime appear to be a kidnapping for ransom. This, they believed, would be the perfect misdirection. It would provide a motive that was entirely false, sending the police down a rabbit hole while they, the true culprits, watched from a safe intellectual distance. They typed a ransom note on a stolen typewriter, a machine they later discarded. The note was deliberately formal and impersonal, demanding $10,000 in old, unmarked bills. It included elaborate, convoluted instructions for the money drop, designed to be so complex that they could later claim the kidnapper simply got spooked and never showed. The choice of weapon was also carefully considered. They settled on a simple steel chisel. It was easy to conceal, and they reasoned, would inflict a type of wound that was less identifiable than a gunshot or a knife stabbing. They even purchased a length of rope and hydrochloric acid. The rope was for strangulation, a backup method, and the acid was to be used to obscure the victim's facial features and fingerprints, making identification as difficult as possible. The final crucial element was the victim. They needed someone they knew, someone who would trust them enough to get into their car without a struggle. But the victim also had to be irrelevant to them personally. The act had to be motiveless, an expression of pure will. They spent weeks scouting potential targets in their Kenwood neighborhood, considering and discarding several possibilities. Their final choice was made on the spur of the moment, a victim of pure chance. On the afternoon of Wednesday, May 21, 1924, Leopold and Loeb put their plan into action. Leopold rented a dark blue Willys Night automobile under a false name, a car he knew would be untraceable to his family. They spent the afternoon driving around Kenwood, the chisel wrapped in surgical tape lying on the floor of the car. They were looking for a suitable victim. They nearly gave up, but as they were driving near the Harvard School for Boys, they saw him. 14-year-old Robert Bobby Franks. Bobby was the son of another wealthy Kenwood millionaire, Jacob Franks. He was also Richard Loeb's second cousin. He knew both of them. He was the perfect target. Loeb called out to Bobby, offering him a ride and a chance to look at a new tennis racket. Bobby, knowing and trusting his older cousin, climbed into the front passenger seat without hesitation. The car pulled away. The entire abduction took only a few seconds and went completely unnoticed on the quiet residential street. What happened next has been a point of contention, with each killer later blaming the other for delivering the fatal blow. According to Leopold's confession as he drove, Loeb, who was in the back seat, struck Bobby in the head with the chisel multiple times. A gag was stuffed into the boy's mouth to silence his cries. Within moments, Bobby Franks was dead. They had done it. They had committed their perfect crime. But the thrill they had anticipated, the feeling of godlike power, never came. Instead, there was only the grim, logistical reality of having a body in their car. They drove for hours, waiting for darkness to fall. They stopped for a meal, leaving the boy's body covered with a robe in the back of the car. Their conversation, by Leopold's account, was clinical and detached. They critiqued their own performance, noting what went well and what could have been improved, as if they were reviewing a school project. After sunset, they drove south of Chicago to a remote, swampy area near the Indiana border, a place called Wolf Lake. It was an area Nathan Leopold knew well from his bird-watching expeditions. They carried Bobby's small body to a culvert, a concrete drainage pipe running under the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks. They stripped the boy's clothes off to make identification more difficult. Then they poured the hydrochloric acid over his face and body, a futile attempt to erase his identity. They pushed him into the dark, watery pipe and watched him disappear. Believing they had left no clues, they drove back to Chicago. On the way, Leopold mailed the ransom note. Later that evening, he calmly placed a phone call to the Franks household, identifying himself as George Johnson and informing them that their son had been kidnapped and that instructions would follow. They had set their elaborate stage. Now all they had to do was watch the play unfold. The next morning, the city awoke to the news of the kidnapping of Bobby Franks. The story was front-page news, a terrifying intrusion into the cloistered world of Chicago's elite. The Franks family was distraught, but they followed the kidnapper's instructions precisely, waiting by the phone for the next call. Leopold called again, dictating the complex instructions for the ransom drop. But the plan immediately went wrong. A nervous family member misheard the instructions, and by the time Jacob Franks arrived at the designated drugstore to await the next call, the kidnapper had already hung up. The elaborate ransom drop, the centerpiece of their misdirection, had failed. For Leopold and Loeb, this was a minor setback. They believed the police would now assume the kidnappers had been scared off and that the trail would go cold. They felt secure, confident in their intellectual superiority. But their confidence was tragically, fatally misplaced. While the police and the Franks family were still operating under the assumption that this was a kidnapping, a Polish immigrant worker, Tony Mink, made a gruesome discovery near Wolf Lake. He saw a flash of pale skin in the culvert. It was the body of a young boy. The police were called, and the body was soon identified. It was Bobby Franks. The kidnapping case had become a murder investigation. The city was gripped by a mixture of horror and outrage. The Chicago police, under intense public pressure, launched one of the largest manhunts in the city's history. The press descended on the case, dubbing it the crime of the century. The initial investigation, however, yielded few leads. The crime seemed motiveless. Bobby was a good kid from a good family. He had no known enemies. The police were baffled. The crime scene itself offered little. The area around the culvert was muddy and trampled. The boy's body had been badly damaged, but not so much as to be unidentifiable. The police collected what little they could, including the boy's discarded clothing, and then a searcher found something. Lying in the muck a few feet from where the body had been hidden was a pair of horn-rimmed eyeglasses. They were unremarkable at first glance, but they would become the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case. The glasses were taken into evidence, one small item among many. To Leopold and Loeb, their loss was a complete unknown. In the hurried, clumsy disposal of the body in the dark, Nathan Leopold's glasses had fallen from his jacket pocket. The perfect crime now had a fatal flaw. In the days following the murder, Leopold and Loeb inserted themselves directly into the investigation. They offered theories to reporters, discussed the case with their friends and family, and even spoke with police officers, offering their help as concerned members of the community. They relished the attention and the secret knowledge they possessed. Leopold, in a particularly brazen move, told a reporter, "If I were to murder anybody, it would be just such a cocky little son of a bitch as Bobby Franks." It was an act of supreme arrogance, a taunt from a man who believed he was untouchable. They constructed an elaborate alibi for the day of the murder. They claimed they had spent the entire day together, driving Leopold's car around Chicago, picking up girls they couldn't name, and drinking. It was a flimsy story, but they believed their social standing and reputations would shield them from any serious scrutiny. Meanwhile, the police investigation continued. The city offered a massive reward for information. Hundreds of suspects were questioned, including teachers at the Harvard School, disgruntled former employees of the Franks family, and known criminals. The investigation was spinning its wheels, but the eyeglasses remained. An investigator, Captain William Shoemaker, noticed a small, unusual detail on the frames. A patented special hinge that held the earpiece to the lens frame. It was a specific, identifiable piece of hardware. The police began the painstaking work of tracing that hinge. They discovered it was a new, uncommon design, sold almost exclusively by one optician in Chicago, Ulmer Coe & Company. The investigators went to the store and learned that the hinge was so new that they had sold only 3 pairs of glasses with that specific design. The store's records provided the names of the 3 customers. The first was a lawyer who was in Europe at the time of the murder. The second was a man who could prove he had been elsewhere. The third name on the list was Nathan F. Leopold, Jr. When the police discovered that the prescription of the glasses perfectly matched Leopold's, they knew they had their first concrete lead. They had physically connected Nathan Leopold, a brilliant university student and son of a millionaire, to the place where Bobby Frank's body was found. On May 29th, 8 days after the murder, police brought Leopold in for questioning. He was the picture of calm confidence. He smiled, answered their questions politely, and explained away the glasses. He claimed he must have lost them during one of his birdwatching trips to the Wolf Lake area. It was a plausible explanation. Leopold was known to frequent the area for his ornithological research. He then confidently recited his alibi with Richard Loeb for the day of the murder. He claimed they had been driving his car, a Red Willie's night. When the police asked to see the car, Leopold agreed without hesitation. But the family chauffeur, when questioned separately, told the police a different story. He said that Leopold's car had been in the family garage all day on May 21st, undergoing repairs. Leopold had not used his own car. He had used a rental. The alibi had crumbled. The police now knew Leopold was lying. They intensified their questioning, separating him from Loeb. For 2 days they questioned them relentlessly. Leopold, the genius, held firm, his arrogance unshaken. He believed he could outwit them, that his intellect was a fortress they could not breach. Loeb, however, was a different story. The charming, confident facade began to crack under the pressure. State's Attorney Robert Crowe, a masterful and intimidating prosecutor, laid out the evidence for Loeb. He told him about the glasses. He told him about the chauffeur's testimony, which proved their alibi was a lie. Crowe then bluffed. He told Loeb that Leopold had already confessed and had placed the entire blame on him. Loeb, whose entire self-image was built on being the clever mastermind, panicked. He believed Leopold had betrayed him, and so Richard Loeb confessed. He told the police everything, detailing the months of planning and the brutal murder. His only caveat was that he claimed Leopold had been the one to strike the fatal blow with the chisel. When the police confronted Leopold with Loeb's confession, he was stunned into silence. The fortress had been breached. His partner, the object of his devotion, had broken their pact. For a moment he seemed to collapse. Then his own arrogance resurfaced. He admitted his role in the crime but insisted that Loeb's account was wrong. He, Leopold, had only been the driver. It was Loeb, the thrill-seeker, who had wielded the chisel. The two supermen, who had believed they were united in their superiority, were now reduced to frightened boys, desperately trying to blame each other for a murder they had committed together. The confessions were a sensation. The city, which had been horrified by the crime, was now utterly captivated by the culprits. They were not monsters from the city's underworld. They were two of their own, children of privilege and genius. The question on everyone's lips was no longer who, but why, and in their confessions, Leopold and Loeb gave the chilling, unbelievable answer. They did it for the experience, for the thrill, to prove that they could. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. The newspapers ran banner headlines, calling them the thrill killers, the supercriminals, the Madog killers. There were calls for swift and brutal justice. The Franks and Loeb families, both devastated and shamed, hired the most famous defense attorney in America, Clarence Darrow. Darrow was 67 years old, a towering figure in American law, a champion of the underdog, and a staunch, lifelong opponent of the death penalty. He had defended labor leaders, anarchists, and accused murderers. Taking the case of two wealthy, unrepentant killers seemed a strange choice, but for Darrow it presented the ultimate challenge. He wasn't just defending two boys. He was putting the entire concept of capital punishment on trial. Faced with two detailed confessions and overwhelming physical evidence, Darrow knew that a traditional defense was impossible. A jury trial would be a death sentence. The public was whipped into a frenzy, and no jury in Chicago would be able to see past the horrific nature of the crime. So, Darrow made a stunning tactical decision. On July 21, 1924, he walked into the courtroom and had both Leopold and Loeb plead guilty to murder and kidnapping. This maneuver completely bypassed a jury. The sentencing would be decided by a single man, the presiding judge, John R. Caverly. Darrow's strategy was to transform the trial from a question of guilt or innocence into a philosophical and psychological hearing on the nature of punishment. His goal was not to free his clients, but to save them from the gallows. The sentencing hearing began in the sweltering heat of the Chicago summer. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters and morbidly curious spectators. State's Attorney Robert Crowe presented the prosecution's case. He methodically laid out the facts of the crime, the cold-blooded planning, the brutal murder, and the killer's shocking lack of remorse. He called witness after witness to establish the premeditated nature of the act. Crowe's argument was simple and powerful. This was a crime born of pure evil, of a cold, calculating, murderous heart. He argued that the boys' wealth, education, and intelligence made their crime even more heinous. They knew right from wrong and chose wrong. For such a crime, he demanded the only appropriate penalty, death by hanging. He was a formidable orator, and his closing argument was a passionate appeal to the judge to deliver the justice the public craved. Then it was Darrow's turn. For weeks he presented a novel and controversial defense. He brought in a series of pioneering psychiatrists and neurologists, alienists as they were then called, who testified about the mental states of Leopold and Loeb. They painted a picture of two deeply disturbed young men. Leopold, they argued, was a paranoid schizophrenic, living in a world of fantasy and delusion, his emotional development stunted and warped by his obsessive devotion to Loeb. Loeb, they claimed, was a classic sociopath, devoid of emotion, driven by a pathological need for thrills that began in childhood. Darrow's argument was revolutionary for its time. He was using the still nascent fields of psychology and psychoanalysis to argue that his clients were not evil, but sick. Their actions, he contended, were not a product of free will, but were predetermined by a complex web of psychological, genetic, and environmental factors beyond their control. This line of defense was ridiculed by the prosecution and the press. Crow mocked Darrow's million-dollar experts and their glandular theories. But Darrow was laying the groundwork for his true purpose. The expert testimony was just the prelude to his final epic summation. On August 22, 1924, Clarence Darrow began his closing argument. He spoke for over 12 hours, spread across 2 days. He was exhausted, his suit rumpled, his voice often cracking with emotion. But his words held the courtroom spellbound. It was not just a legal argument. It was a philosophical plea for mercy and reason over vengeance and hate. He began by acknowledging the horror of the crime and the immense suffering of the Franks family. He did not ask for forgiveness for his clients. Instead, he asked for understanding. He painted a picture of their lonely, isolated childhoods, suffocated by wealth and intellectual pressure. He spoke of the strange, toxic chemistry between them, a strange compact that led them down a path neither would have walked alone. He argued that their fascination with Nietzsche was not the cause of their crime, but a symptom of their diseased minds. A healthy mind, he argued, does not read philosophy and decide to commit murder. He asked the judge, "Is any blame attached because somebody took Nietzsche's philosophy seriously and fashioned his life upon it? It is hardly fair to hang a 19-year-old boy for the philosophy that was taught him at the university." Darrow's argument methodically dismantled the prosecution's call for vengeance. He reminded the judge that the law is not just about retribution. It is also about preventing future crimes. He asked, "What is this case? Is it a case of murder?" "Yes." "Is it a case of kidnapping?" "Yes." "But is that all? Is it not a case that calls for the careful, kindly, and understanding study of the human mind?" He argued that hanging these 2 boys would teach society nothing. It would only satisfy a primal bloodlust. True justice, he argued, lay in studying them, in trying to understand the complex forces that had created them, so that such a tragedy might be prevented in the future. The core of his argument was a direct assault on the death penalty itself. He appealed to the judge's sense of history, of progress, of mercy. He reminded Judge Caverly that the history of justice has been a slow, steady march away from barbarism. He said, "I am pleading for the future. I am pleading for a time when hatred and cruelty will not control the hearts of men, when we can learn by reason and judgment and understanding and faith that all life is worth saving, and that mercy is the highest attribute of man." He placed the weight of this historical progress directly on the judge's shoulders. He framed the decision not as a choice between life and death for 2 individuals, but as a choice for the kind of society they wanted to live in, one governed by emotion and vengeance, or one guided by reason and humanity. He concluded his marathon speech with a direct personal plea to Judge Caverly. He admitted his clients were deserving of punishment, but not of death. "I am pleading for the lives of these 2 boys," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I do not know how much salvage there is in these 2 lives. All I know is that if the judgment of this court is death, you will read it in the face of every boy in the United States." He ended with a line that would echo through legal history. "Your honor stands between the past and the future. You may hang these boys. You may hang them by the neck until they are dead. But in doing it, you will turn your face toward the past." With that, he slumped back into his chair, physically and emotionally spent. The courtroom was silent. For 10 days, the city, and indeed the nation, held its breath. The fate of Leopold and Loeb rested in the hands of one man. On September 10, 1924, Judge John R. Caverly delivered his verdict. He began by condemning the crime in the strongest possible terms, calling it a cruel, dastardly, and cowardly murder. He dismissed Darrow's psychiatric evidence as largely irrelevant to the question of legal responsibility. He made it clear that he believed the boys were sane and fully accountable for their actions. It seemed certain he was building to a sentence of death. But then he pivoted. He spoke of the youth of the defendants. Nathan Leopold was 19, Richard Loeb 18. He noted that in the history of Cook County, no one so young had ever been executed after a guilty plea. He stated that while the crime was horrific, his decision could not be based on public sentiment or emotion. It had to be based on the law and its precedents. He said, "It is within the province of the court to decline to impose the sentence of death on persons who are not of full age." And so, for the murder of Bobby Franks, he sentenced Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb to life in prison. For the kidnapping, he added an additional sentence of 99 years. There would be no parole. It was a stunning victory for Clarence Darrow. He had not won them their freedom, but he had saved them from the gallows. The public was largely outraged by the verdict, believing the boys had used their wealth and a clever lawyer to escape the justice they deserved. But the decision stood. The crime of the century had reached its legal conclusion. The two boy geniuses were sent to Joliet prison. Their life as supermen was over, replaced by the grim, monotonous reality of prison life. Their relationship, which had been the catalyst for their crime, quickly soured in confinement. In 1936, Richard Loeb, the charismatic mastermind, was killed in a prison shower. A fellow inmate, James Day, attacked him with a straight razor, slashing him over 50 times. Day claimed Loeb had made an unwanted sexual advance, though many believed it was a targeted hit. Loeb, who had dreamed of being a master criminal, died at the age of 30, a victim of the brutal world he had for so long looked down upon. Nathan Leopold, meanwhile, became a model prisoner. He threw his formidable intellect into his new life. He reorganized the prison library, taught other inmates to read, and worked in the prison hospital. During a malaria epidemic in 1944, he volunteered for a series of dangerous medical experiments, deliberately allowing himself to be infected with the disease to test new treatments. After 33 years in prison, after being denied parole numerous times, Nathan Leopold was finally released in 1958. He was 53 years old. He moved to Puerto Rico, married, and worked as a hospital X-ray technician and laboratory assistant. He wrote a book about birds and expressed remorse for his crime, though the depth of his regret was often questioned. He died of a heart attack in 1971, a quiet end for a man whose name was once synonymous with unthinkable evil. In the end, what is the anatomy of this thrill kill? It is a case study in the terrifying gulf between intelligence and morality. Leopold and Loeb were not driven by the usual human motives of rage, or greed, or lust. They were driven by an intellectual vanity so profound that it saw another human life as nothing more than a variable in an equation, a pawn in a game they were playing against society. Their crime was a perversion of knowledge, a demonstration of how philosophy, when filtered through the lens of narcissism and sociopathy, can become a justification for monstrosity. Clarence Darrow's defense did more than just save 2 lives. It forced the American legal system to confront uncomfortable questions about free will, responsibility, and the true purpose of punishment. He introduced complex psychological concepts into the courtroom, ideas that would evolve over the decades and fundamentally change how we view criminal culpability. The case became a permanent cultural touchstone, a chilling story told and retold in books, plays, and films, a warning about the darkness that can fester behind a mask of privilege and genius. It is a reminder that the capacity for cruelty is not limited to the ignorant or the uneducated. The most brilliant of minds can author the most horrific of acts, proving that intellect without empathy is not a higher form of consciousness, but the most dangerous form of blindness. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.